We are very pleased to have Leanne join us, and she's going to kind of go over what is our current state of play, so that we can now really understand where we are with the virus, the pandemic, and then we'll move into our facilitated discussion about topics related to fruit and vegetable operations. Leanne?
Well, I'm delighted to be here, and I'm not going to talk for very long, probably only 10, maybe 15 minutes. And the purpose of my presentation is largely, and several of you I think have heard me speak before, but we actually kind of are starting to get our arms around why it is we are using the particular controls we are relative to COVID transmission. And so I want to try to make that as clear as possible so that we kind of all understand why we're doing what it is we are doing. So I'm going to take a big step back and say, okay, when this came into the scene in January, particularly as it entered the United States, what were some of the transmission commonalities that we saw? And I think probably the first thing we really publicly heard about was nursing homes, particularly the outbreak that happened in Washington State. And then there were cruises. There were a couple cruises where there were outbreaks. And then we would hear about some business networking events. I know that there actually was a big networking event up in Boston, which is technically what brought the virus down to my home state of North Carolina. And then family events, workplaces, churches, and sporting events in general, okay? So that's where the outbreaks came from, or seemed to be originating when this whole thing started. And this is a nice little graph from a recent paper that kind of shows how all of these venues kind of played into the initial cases. And I want to add that transportation is a really, really important part, particularly subways and trains. We now know were also involved in some of these initial events. And so what are the common themes? Well, the common themes of these are indoors. These are all this transmission appeared to be indoors. And in situations that did and did not have good ventilation, but some of the early outbreaks, actually, there was some evidence that the virus was moving through ventilation systems, and so skipping floors or skipping across wide ranges in a large building. Another commonality is close face-to-face contact between people, and in many instances it's between people for extended periods of time. So it's not just a short period of time, they're together for a long period of time. And finally, in almost all of these cases, there's talking, there's singing, there's yelling, all of those kinds of stuff. So there is this use of the mouth, so to speak. So as we began to understand or learn more about the virus, there were a few things that became really clear. And we now actually have the science to back this up, okay? One of the things we talked about was how long is the incubation period? In other words, how long is the time between when you're first exposed and when you first show symptoms, okay? And bottom line is the mean is 5 days, but the range is up to 2 weeks. And actually, there's new evidence that's saying the range could even extend into a month, okay? But for purposes of what we're kind of classically looking at, it's up to 2 weeks before you get symptoms if you're infected. That's number one, okay? Number two is that a lot of people were getting sick who didn't seem to be exposed to somebody who was sick. So in the early days, they were saying, okay, don't cough on somebody, don't sneeze on somebody. It's got to be people who are coughing and sneezing in the environment that are causing this problem. But a lot of people were not coughing and sneezing in the environment, and other people were getting sick. So what the heck was going on? Well, what we now know is two things. Number one, people shed the virus in that incubation period time in which they aren't showing symptoms. Okay, so you're transmissible even if you look completely healthy. Furthermore, there's a high proportion of the population that never shows symptoms, even if they're infected. Okay, so those are completely asymptomatic individuals. So you can get sick from exposure to pre-symptomatic people, and the current thought is that about 50% of cases are spread from these people. 50% of cases are spread from these people. So you could be next to somebody and have no idea that they were infected, and they could technically be infecting you. So this paper came out about a week ago, and I love this paper, and there have been some blogs that have been written about it. And what these investigators did is they looked at the old data and the old information on respiratory spread of viruses, which is pretty old. Some of it goes back into the 50s. And they did a little bit of filming and a lot of kind of thought exercises. And their hypothesis is that the mechanism of spread for COVID is what's called a turbulent gas cloud. And a turbulent gas cloud is released anytime we're using our mouth, okay? If you have an upper respiratory tract infection. And that was the one thing I forgot to mention here, is we now know this virus multiplies in the throat, basically, okay? And that's very different from influenza and a lot of the respiratory viruses, which replicate more in the chest area. If you're replicating in the throat area, then what that means is that anything that's in the throat and in that area of the mouth is going to be spewed forth. So when you cough, when you sneeze, when you talk, when you breathe, okay, you are releasing a turbulent gas cloud, which is pretty disgusting, really. And the turbulent gas cloud consists of large and small aerosolized droplets. Okay, so there's big wet droplets, okay, and these small droplets that are aerosolized out. And you can see here on the top, there's a picture of what that cloud looks like. And both the large and the small droplets contain virus, okay? So what happens with the large droplets, if you're releasing virus, okay, and you breathe, or if somebody's releasing virus and you breathe in a droplet, okay, that may be enough to initiate infection. We're going to talk about that in just a second, okay? The bottom line is that to prevent somebody from inhaling in these large droplets, you can control that by the use of masks and the use of social distancing. You get far enough away, you can't get the droplets because they've already fallen to the surface. You use masks, you're protecting yourself. Or you're protecting other people from getting infected. So all these clouds of tiny aerosol droplets that linger in the air for at least minutes and maybe hours, okay? And they can travel long distances because they're really tiny and they don't fall to surfaces very quickly. So they can be impacted by ventilation, they can move around, and preventing them from being released is also an advantage of masking, because if you are infected, you don't release that aerosol into the environment when you talk. Finally, those large droplets also fall to surfaces, okay? And those surfaces then become contaminated with the virus. And the problem is that unlike most enveloped viruses, where they don't stay alive or infectious on a surface for very long, this virus does stay infectious on surface for a matter of days. Okay, how do you deal with that? You deal with it by surface disinfection, particularly high touch surfaces, and of course hand sanitation. So this is a very cool kind of a preliminary risk assessment that was done in a blog post, and I almost never take stuff from the internet and put it on a slide, but I did in this case. So think about it this way. The amount of virus that you shed in that aerosol plume, okay, depends on your illness status. So if you're sick and have symptoms and are infected, and you cough or you sneeze close to somebody, you're releasing millions of virus particles. If you're asymptomatic but infected, whether that's pre-symptomatic or you're never going to have symptoms but you're still infected, okay, you release virus but you don't release as much. Okay, so the estimate that they came up with, if you're breathing, you're releasing about 20 viruses per minute. If you're speaking, you're releasing about 200 per minute. Okay? Infection always has to do with reaching the infectious dose. Okay? And the infectious dose that these people estimated, and we don't know what the infectious dose for COVID is, but using what has been observed for SARS-1 and for MERS, they estimated 1,000 particles. So you have to get 1,000 particles in order to get sick, okay? That means that if you're sneezed or coughed on by somebody who is in close proximity to you, okay, you're gonna get that infectious dose immediately. But if you're exposed to somebody who's asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic, okay, it's a function of the amount of virus that's released and time. So if you do the math, a single cough, if you do the math, about 5 minutes of speaking or about an hour of breathing in close proximity to an asymptomatic person will be enough virus to make you sick or to make you infected. So that in and of itself is the reason why not only do we have one transmission control, we have multiple transmission controls, okay? You certainly gotta identify the ill individuals, and you need to get them out of the workplace, out of the situation where they can infect other people. And you all know we do it by screening. You can potentially do it by testing, although we're not doing that at the commercial level right now. You need to isolate and exclude them. You need to trace contacts, because that removes the source of infection that you can identify. What does social distancing do? Well, it puts distance between the respiratory plumes and any infected or non-infected individuals, okay? So the further away you are from airborne virus, the less likely you are going to be infected. And we say 6 feet or more, okay, for caution. Personal protective equipment, particularly face coverings, which has been a huge sort of can of worms. Okay, the bottom line here is that PPE or face coverings does not adequately protect the uninfected individual. In other words, you should not be wearing a face mask because you think it's going to prevent you from getting COVID. Because the efficacy of a face mask depends on the material that you use as well as how well it fits. What a face mask does is it traps respiratory droplets from an infected individual and then it prevents those from being spread to an uninfected individual. So you're infecting your coworkers or your family or whatever when you wear a face mask. And of course, stepped up hygiene and sanitation, hands and surfaces, is, what does that do? It inactivates the virus that's released in these large droplets and settles down into surfaces. In the case of hands, well, it inactivates any virus you might pick up from a surface. It can also, hands are just a great, I think the stats, you touch their faces, it's like 10 times a minute or something like that. So hands are a vector anyway, because you're constantly kind of touching your face. And the bottom line is you have to have all of those controls in place in order to adequately protect against transmission of this virus. It's not a one and done, it's a 4 and done.